get my cup of tea. Okay, so yeah, my name's Alison and I'm the CEO of FAR. And often when I'm talking to people about my role, the most common response I get is that people don't actually know what arable research is. They quite often mishear it and think I'm saying animal research. And so one of the biggest problems that our industry has is that we have a relatively low profile in sort of agriculture in New Zealand. And I spend a lot of my time just trying to explain to people what arable cropping is. And I mean, I'm assuming that most of you probably have more of a knowledge about it than the general public. But just to get you all on the same page, when we're talking about arable cropping, we're talking about growing any crops that are harvested by a combine. And so that's all of our cereal crops, you know, wheat, barley, oats, maize, and you know, and that could be for, you know, silage, or it can be for grains. But then we also grow a lot of seed crops as well. So a lot of people don't realize that, you know, as part of our rotation, we'll have high value seed crops, and we basically multiply up those seed crops for export to large seed companies overseas. And that substantially increases the profitability of the arable system. And so New Zealand is renowned for being very good at growing seed crops. So we produce about 70% of the world's radish seed, probably 50% of the world's clover seed, and 50% of the world's carrot seed. So, you know, for a small country, we actually contribute quite substantially to other people's economies. And if you think about our cereal growing and our maize growing, a large portion of what we're growing is actually going for animal feed, which is a little bit perverse because, you know, we are the world leaders in producing high quality, high volume sort of barley and wheat, and we've got two farmers who are the sort of world holders for yield for both barley and wheat, and we have been for a number of years. So we're recognized internationally as the very best cropping farmers in the world, but most of our grain, our really good quality grain, actually goes for animal feed. And that, I suppose, is a little bit disappointing for us, in the sense that the dairy industry, because, you know, it's a multi-billion-dollar export industry, it will quite often pay a higher value for animal feed than the mills and the bakers will pay for milling wheat for human feed. And so that's a bit disappointing, because it means there's an awful lot of really high quality cereal crops and maize grain being produced, and it's just going for animal feed because the growers can get a better price for that. And we're trying to change that. We're trying to get the New Zealand consumer to understand the value of the arable industry to New Zealand, and to proactively support New Zealand produce. So we've got a big campaign around that. But probably the other thing that a lot of people don't realize is that, you know, we actually have a lot of livestock farmers using arable farmers as a means to, graze, do winter grazing on arable crops, or arable farmers bringing, sheep or whatever, or lambs onto their land for finishing off before they're sold. So we're actually incredibly well integrated into the livestock industries. And then when you add on top of that, that we produce all of the seed, the ryegrass seed and the clover seed that the pastoral industry need to grow their grass to feed their animals, then suddenly you recognize that the arable industry is a major underpinning support industry for the livestock sector. And so you get these rather interesting conversations with government policy makers, and they're talking about land use change, and they say, oh, we really want to de-intensify dairy, and we want to change the land use to something that's more environmentally sustainable, like arable. And we sort of say, well, yes, but if you de-intensify dairy and increase arable, who are we going to sell our seed crops and all of our animal feed to? So, we've got this situation where there's a real lack of understanding of the role that arable cropping plays in New Zealand's agricultural sector. And so we're really worried about sort of, policies being made that have a perverse outcome on the arable sector, because people don't really understand how well integrated it is. I mean, we produce a lot of the process crop seed, like processed peas, we produce all of the seeds. So, we're integrated into vegetable system, into the livestock system, as well as our own individual grain crops. So there's a big education component that we really have to get out there. What I tended to find, I took over this role probably nearly 3 years ago. And at the time, the growers really just wanted to be under the radar. Their view was, well, life is okay as an arable farmer. We make a reasonable amount of money. There's no big red flags. The public don't know how good we are, but then they're not necessarily pointing the finger at us about anything that we're doing wrong. So let's just stay under the radar and not make a big deal about anything. But I've been trying to encourage them to actually be a little bit more proactive and to promote the value that we contribute to New Zealand, and to promote the value that arable cropping can bring as a land use option. But you're dealing with growers that have been on their farm for over 100 years, and they're fairly traditional in one sense, although incredibly innovative in another. But we do have, a large group of growers who really, they just want to be left alone, and they want to be out in the fields driving their tractor. And, every time we talk about, bringing some, new fancy technology to the table and saying, that this will increase their efficiency, they say that's fine as long as I can still drive my tractor. So we have that sort of very ingrained traditional component to the industry, but then we also have this incredibly innovative, quite entrepreneurial component to the industry, because we're always looking for new crops to put into our rotation, or even new farm enterprises, as well as sort of better ways of doing things. And I have to say that I was incredibly sort of impressed by the diversity of the arable system in New Zealand. And I get quite frustrated when we've got this big sort of movement now in New Zealand about regenerative agriculture. And I get frustrated because actually most arable growers already have a lot of diversity in their system. They already have, mixed livestock crops. They already have cover crops, and they're doing a lot of the things that that the government and MPI and a whole load of other environmental groups are saying that New Zealand has to do this, but we've been doing it for 100 years, but not being recognised for it. That doesn't mean, of course, that there aren't improvements that need to be made, and arable cropping is exactly the same as the other sectors. They've all got red flags, and they all have issues that need to be addressed. And my job at FAR is basically to be doing the research to allow growers to be able to transition to management systems that have a lighter touch, that are more sustainable, that have a better environmental footprint. And we actually started doing a lot of that environmental research a decade ago. And even though the farmers at the time, they kept questioning, why is our levy money being used for all of this environmental stuff? And we would be saying it's because, that the way that you've been doing things, whilst it has stood you in good stead over the years, the external environment has changed and the consumers want a different way of doing things, and agriculture will come under the headlights around environmental pollution, and FAR needs to be able to provide the research and the tools and technologies so that we can all transition to something that is a little bit better. And I think that now they recognize the value of us having started that 10 years ago. So I don't know whether I might just stop here and just see if anyone has got any questions that they would like to ask.
So if anyone in the group has any questions, I guess now's a good time to unmute yourself and put a question to Alison. Well, maybe I'll start. I had a question around kind of what the emerging issues are for people in this sector. Like, what do you think are the big topics that constantly come up? I mean, you've mentioned one around kind of involvement in green issues and climate change and things like that, but what else is kind of happening in your sector that you think is going to have to be addressed?
Well, I guess, I mean, we're no different to all the other sectors. I mean, we've got the freshwater reforms that are going to sort of, come into play, and we're going to have to work out how, we can meet, some of those targets that are being put forward. We signed up to the Hiwaka-Ekanoa climate change commitment, and so we've got some greenhouse gas emissions targets that have to be met. I don't see any of those as being particularly challenging. We have the tools and technologies and the pathway for our growers to be able to move forward and meet those targets. But there are some, it depends how the regional councils actually enact the reforms. And sometimes the regional councils will focus on trying to set targets, particularly around, methane emissions or, nitrogen targets. And they tend to have developed those policies with a focus on the livestock sector. So for example, the 190 kg nitrogen application. Now, that is something that the livestock sector, sort of need to address from the point of view of how they're applying nitrogen onto their pastures and the problems that they have with leaching. But if you imposed 190 kg nitrogen limit on an arable farmer, it doesn't make sense, because we apply nitrogen and we work out exactly how much nitrogen's in the soil, how much nitrogen we know that the crop has to take up in order to grow to its maximum potential, and we only apply the shortfall. And so we know when we apply the nitrogen, it will be taken up by the plant and it won't create a leaching problem. And so for us, having a limit doesn't make sense, because if all of our nitrogen is taken up by the plant, it's not creating an environmental issue. It's just creating, a high yielding crop. So we're trying to get people to understand that you really need to focus on the outcome that you're trying to achieve, rather than trying to regulate by imposing targets that may be, appropriate for the livestock industry, but actually don't make any sense at all for the arable sector.
Okay, I had another question. So probably it's just a short one. I've seen a lot of information about the workforce issues that other kind of people within our sector are having. Are you seeing the same thing with workforce in the arable sector, or are things kind of okay? So I've seen issues around training and also bringing workers in for harvesting and things like that.
Yeah. I mean, we don't have the same problems as, say, the horticulture sector, where they need lots of people coming in, you know, just sort of like you know, pick fruit, because, you know, a big arable farm can pretty well be run by about 2 people, you know, and it's usually, you know, the father and son, or the, you know, the husband and wife. And so you don't have this requirement for a large number of people to come in. Probably the only area that we would have the issue would be at harvesting time with the contractors. And the contractors usually bring in people that are skilled in being able to drive, you know, the big harvesters. I mean, they're incredibly expensive bits of equipment. They're quite sophisticated, and it's not something that just anybody off the street can get pulled in to grow and, you know, drive one of these. So we've been working with the contractors to try and make sure that we've got enough capability that we can move around the country at the different, you know, times that the different crops are being harvested. But there probably will be a little bit of a shortfall there. But it's not the same. It's not the same kind of issues that, you know, some of the sector, like the meat, you know, industry sector, or the horticulture sector have. So we've not been impacted by COVID to the same negative extent as, you know, the other sectors, which is, we're very, very fortunate. And of course, sounds awful, but I mean, COVID has raised the profile of bread and flour and pasta, which of course are all of the products that our ingredients go into. And so, you know, if you think about the first thing that went off the supermarket shelf, you know, I mean, if you take away the toilet paper, which was a bizarre sort of situation, you know, it was bread and flour. And suddenly people started thinking about where that bread and flour came from, and would they still be able to get a supply? And so what we found was that our growers actually were able to sell their grain to the mills and the bakers, you know, for a reasonable price. And, you know, we didn't actually have much being stored on farm because it was all needed to fill the supermarket shelves. Now, it would be really nice if, you know, even post-COVID, whatever that situation might be and whenever it might occur, is that the New Zealand consumer would actually want to continue to get that New Zealand grain, you know, coming through into the bread products, rather than at the moment, you know, where most of it is coming in from Australia. And so, you know, this really, really frustrates me that, you know, we have these brilliant growers producing really good quality milling wheat, but, you know, the supply chain is driven by, you know, large volumes of cheap imports. And so if you're a consumer up in Auckland and you go in to buy bread in the supermarket, you might think that you're buying bread made from New Zealand grain, but you most certainly will not. It will be bread made from grain from Australia. And I see there's a question there, is there a nutritional incentive to buy New Zealand grain made bread? No, in the sense that the nutritional content of most cultivars, whether they're grown in New Zealand or Australia, are pretty much the same. You know, there's not a big difference. The big difference is in, I guess, the environmental footprint, because obviously, if you're bringing grain from Australia, it might be cheaper to bring it, but there is an emissions profile that if you looked at, you might question that. Our arable systems are much more diverse and resilient than Australian systems. I mean, they're basically growing thousands of hectares of intensive monocultures, whereas we grow much smaller acreages of diversified systems. So if New Zealand consumers want to support, sustainable, resilient production practices that are, that are diversified and resilient, then a New Zealand arable farm would outcompete, would be better than any other arable system, whether it's from Australia or Canada or Russia, or anywhere. But the consumer doesn't know that, because the large food companies don't want to label bread. They don't want country of origin labeling for bread. They see bread as a cheap commodity to bring the customer into the supermarket, and they want to be able to negotiate on any yearly basis the cheapest possible price that they can get for the flour. And so they don't want to create, a New Zealand SKU where they can promote, 100% New Zealand grain and have, specific branding and a particular differentiated supply chain. It's all about volume, and it's all about the cheapest price. And it annoys the hell out of me.
Alison, how are you going to address that? You said you have a campaign coming up to inform consumers. What are you going to do about it?
It's a real challenge. When I started, as I said, 3 years ago, I'm part of an industry forum called AFIC, which is the Arable Food Industry Council, and that's where all the growers, agencies and the millers and the bakers sort of come together. And I sort of tried to convince the millers and the bakers that this would be a really good thing for New Zealand, to promote New Zealand grain. And I got this sort of like, oh yes, good idea, we're in, we really support it, we think it's a good idea. But then every time I tried to bring an initiative and make it happen, there was just, oh, well, the return on investment isn't quite good enough. Oh, it doesn't quite match, what we want. And I see Jackie asking, Eat New Zealand would be interested. Absolutely, we work with Eat New Zealand, but you must remember that Eat New Zealand is focused very much in the artisan space, and and they talk about, oh, wouldn't it be great if we had, sort of like 1,000 tons of, New Zealand grain, but we're looking at a supply chain that needs to take 800,000 tons. And so Eat New Zealand is a great vehicle to engage with artisan bakers, hopefully food influencers, but they're not going to be able to drive a change in a supply chain that's been embedded, in this existing, sort of price sensitive business model for 100 years. So we've recognized that the only way to do it is to let the consumer know what the current situation is. We did a consumer survey last year, and we basically went out and we asked consumers a whole load of questions around bread in supermarkets and what they wanted and everything. And the interesting thing is that the vast majority of consumers think that they're buying bread made from New Zealand grain. They don't actually know that it's from Australia. So that would be the first thing, to get out there and actually just get the consumer to be aware that, when they pick up bread, and sometimes the wording is really interesting. It'll say, made with the flavor of the Mackenzie country. That means nothing. That just means that, the little grains that might be on the top of the bread might have come from a local grower down south, but the actual bread was made with Australian grain. So there's a whole lot of marketing sort of smoke and mirrors out there where the consumer thinks, oh, well, this must be, sort of New Zealand, because they'll quite often say milled at a local New Zealand mill, or, baked locally, but they're all using Australian grain. So we just need to get that awareness out there, and we've we've contracted a PR company to help us get some stories out there that just highlight the quality of New Zealand grain and the way it's been produced sustainably, and just try and encourage the market to demand. I would like to be able to go into a supermarket and I'd like to be able to go and pick up bread and know that it's been made locally. And so we hope the consumer will encourage the supermarkets to start demanding from the bakers and the millers that they want products coming through that have been made from local grain. That's a big ask though, because the supermarkets are driven by cost, and the entire supply chain is all about driving costs down. But we're going to give it a go and we're going to work with Eat New Zealand, and we're going to just try and create little niche market opportunities, just to see if we can get, disrupt the supply chain and maybe create situations like regionally, sort of try and, get some growers to work directly with retailers instead of going through the big boys. And we have almost a monopoly now in grain purchasing in New Zealand, where there's literally, one company that purchases 80% of the grain and then provides it, to all of the big food companies. And so the growers will, if we leave this situation as it is, the growers are just going to end up having, their grain, the price is just going down and down and down.
Also a matter of food security, I guess, isn't it? With shipping being unreliable at the moment and so on, that could be an aspect to sell to the consumer too, that if it's locally grown, we know that we have got a supply.
Absolutely. But interestingly, when I mentioned this, because it all gets very political, when you start talking about, we should be promoting local grown because we want to be have food security with all of our staple crops and staple produce, then the other industries get quite twitchy because, of course, they're export dominated. The government gets quite twitchy because of the free trade agreements. They say, oh, well, no, we can't be seen to be, being, sort of trade protectionism. And we're saying, well, it's not trade protectionism, like we're quite happy for Australian grain to come into New Zealand. And if the New Zealand consumer wants to buy the cheapest bread, then that's their entitlement. We just want to give the New Zealand consumer the opportunity to buy New Zealand bread and be able to go into a supermarket and be able to identify that that loaf was produced by a New Zealand grower. But yeah, it's amazing how people get very sensitive when you start talking about food security.
Okay, do we have any last questions for Alison while we've got her? Okay, well, it sounds like we've kind of come to a natural end. Yeah. I do have loads more questions, but maybe we'll leave it to another day. Thank you so much for your time today, Alison. It's been really great to hear from you and to learn more about the work that you're doing as an organisation and your upcoming campaigns. I'm sure that our members of the Guild got a lot out of it, and we'll probably have some follow-ups for you, I'm sure. So what I'll do is I'll put the recording up online and send you the link to that. And also, if anyone needs to talk to you or follow up, are you happy for me to pass on your contact details?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Okay. I mean, we really want to get our story out there. And so, the more that I can get to talk to journalists and explain to them, what the industry is and what we're trying to achieve, the better.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Everyone. Ka kite.